So now we start Tavav. B'shutfim lo matzu memirin. We have halacha that's established in the Gemara Tmura on Daf Yud Gimel that since the entire parsha of Tmura is written in the singular form, therefore shutfim cannot create Tmura. So now we're going to have to assume that these two brothers who inherited their father's carbon are shutfim, meaning there was a kinyan. Because Iyamrit lo kanyalahu is emuri nami limru. Emuri is a conjugated verb for the word tmura, for the noun tmura. They should be able to make tmura. So at what point do we say they are shutfim, and there is a kinyan, and therefore they can't bring the carbon mincha that they inherited from the father? At one point do we say no? They're not shutfim at all. There's no kinyan. So the Gemara says, Shani Hasam, there's Xeris HaKosav, the Yom Kra, Im Hamer Yamir, the double language, L'Rabos Es HaYoresh. So normally we would say that the Parsha of Tmura is all written in the singular to exclude Shutfim, but here it's Yomir, Homer Yemer, Echad Memer V'Ein Shnayim Emirim, and the exception is going to be a Yoresh. So again, even though we're holding now that Yorshim did not have a kinyan, and that's why, according to Rabbi Yochanan, the two Yorshim can bring the mincha of their father because they don't have a kinyan and there's no shutfis, so they bring it as like two yechidim. But the exception to the rule is by Tmura that the two brothers cannot be meimir. I'm sorry, that the two brothers, what did Rabbi Yochanan say again? They cannot be meimir. I'm going to say no because that's an exception to the rule. So wait, so now what are we holding? The bottom line, what are we holding now? Let me just get this straight. We are holding that that there is no kinyan. That's why they can't bring the mincha. And the fact that they can't do tmura, that's an exception to the rule. So like a special quasi-shutfis to exclude tmura. So if on the bottom line we're holding now, even after Rabbi Yochanan, that there is no kinyan, just 1 second. I'm sorry, that what? Right, that there is a kinyan, right? Because he passes the mincha, right? Oh, I keep saying that over and over again. Once you get a mistake, you repeat it. No, Rabbi Yochanan says that they can bring the carbon mincha because ein lehem shutfis. It means that there is no kinyan, and if there is no kinyan, then we don't have Rabbi Loz's precedent that liachar misa, the Yorshim, could achieve kapara from the father. They don't have a kinyan, so therefore they cannot achieve kapara. And then we're back to Rabbi Yochanan's question: where do you find a precedent for a kapara for a carbon that's kosher without ritzui? Maskif lo Rav Yaakov min our prod elamiata. If we come to this conclusion that there's no kinyan, here's a case where you need like a whiteboard here. Right, I just write down that the mincha is kosher. Right, so what are we saying? That there is no kinyan. Is then Gabi Meiser, the Sivim, Ga'ol Yigal, the same kind of double language that we saw in the case of Meimer Homer Yomir, is the Rabos Es Hayoresh. right? So if Chanoch ben Ruvain inherits his father's Ruvain's Maser Sheni, then he can be poda the Maser Sheni, and he'll have to add a Chomesh. So Hochinami, should we say Echad Goel v'Ein Shnaim Goelim? Should we come to the conclusion that these two brothers that inherited their father's Maser Sheni cannot be poda their father's Maser Sheni because Go'ol Yigal implies only the singular and not Shutfim? And the Gemara says Shiny Maser de Gabi Avuon Nami Isa b'Shutfis. Had the father been a partner with somebody else, he could be poda his bilus on the half that he owed. So therefore, when he dies, the same ability to be poda, the maser, now transfers through inheritance over to the son. Okay. Now, we had a derivation that a yoresh can effectuate tmura, and that required a special derivation because it's a case where there are two yarshim, and we would have said that shufinu cannot achieve tmura, but we have here a pasuk. Omle Ravasi Ravashi, Iam Bishlam Kanyalahu Hainu Dechad Miomemer. Right, one of the two yarshim, if he is the bailim, he can effectuate tmura. Let's see the Gemara's kasha. Lo kanyalahu. And if the heirs did not acquire ownership on the korban, hechi memir. So again, I think what hechi memir, he's referring to a single yoresh, not shutfim. Because in the case of shutfim, Rabbi Yochanan said, "Hiniach be'emel shnei banav umes kreva v'ema mirno." So because then you have shutfis. But again, if there was only one heir, then he could be memir. So the Gemara says, "Ila amitbil lo kanyu hainu hechi memir." So now that we're holding from Rabbi Yochanan's statement in Karban Mincha that the Shutfim could bring the Karban Mincha their father, so we're holding that there's no Kinyan. So how could the Yoresh be Memir? Omar Rabbi Avo, Omar Rabbi Yochanan Hamagdish Mosif Chomesh, Umiskaper Ose Tmura. Okay, so now we have a case where Shimon is bringing a korban on behalf of Ruvain. Reuven was magdish the carbon for himself. Shimon is now bringing the carbon on behalf of Reuven. And if the carbon gets a mum and we poda it, you have to add a chomesh. Who has to pay that chomesh? And the answer is the magdish has to pay the chomesh. Who has the ability to make tmura, meaning who's the bailim? Miskaper osa tmura means Reuven, who's getting kapara from this carbon, he's the one who could make tmura. Because he's the owner of the carbon. Fine. So what do we see from all of this? That he who gets the kapara, he can effectuate tmura. And now we have a problem, because if we're saying that it wasn't two brothers that inherited the father, it was only one, then he can effectuate tmura. It must be because he's considered the bailim, because only the bailim can make tmura. So it's like a modus tollens over here, right? There is no tmura except for bailim, right? Only bailim can make tmura. An heir could make tmura, therefore an heir has to be considered bailim. And this undermines everything we've been saying now, that there's no such thing as inheriting bailus. Because if there is inheriting bailus, then we have a very great answer to Reish Lakish's question, because we have a precedent for someone who brings a carbon without ritzui. So the Gemara answers, Mikiva lo mechapra, mikufya mechapra. Like there are different levels of kapara. So there's a level of kapara which is called kvia. It's permanent. And then you have mikufya. Mikufya means like floating on the surface. And it's not a real kapara. So the Yoresh, even though he's not bailim, he has enough of a, kufra, of kufya makapra in order to generate tmura. So he says here, an heir can effectuate tmura because he has some element of at least superficial kapara. Iboilahu kipru al mashebo olo kipru. In this case, where they brought the carbon shalol lishma, and we said that the Bailam have to bring a second carbon to replace the first, but yet it is the first carbon, despite the shalol lishma, is kosher. Do the Bailam achieve kapara? Again, they're going to have to bring a second carbon to replace the first, but at least in the interim, they're protected by this carbon that's being brought from any punishment. Amar Rav Shisha, great Rav Yidi, Mistabra de lo Kipru, Tisakadaita Kipru is Sheni Loma Huba. If he achieves his kapara for whatever sin, whatever he's guilty of with the first carbon that was shechted shalol shma, then why are you bringing a second carbon? What's the point? Honestly, this sounds so similar to Reish Lakish, but anyway. Vela my lo kipru. So what are you going to tell me, Rav Shisha, that they don't get any atonement whatsoever? Is lama hu karib. So why are you bringing the carbon? Now, on this question, why do you bring a carbon? I have problems here because the carbon is kosher. What do you mean? Why do you bring the carbon? You have a carbon kosher. It's inherent in the behemoth, in the carbon. I don't know. Anyway, Rav Ashi, Rav Shisha, Rav Vidi Hachi Kokashale. Let's reformulate the question of Rav Shisha. If you're going to tell me that there was no kapar through this carbon that was brought shalol lishmo, is shalol lishmo mikoach lishmo ka'asi. And therefore, Sheni Loma Huba. Bishleim, if you say that the first carbon per se, without the second one, is not going to achieve kapara, then I could say that kapara, which was inherent in the first carbon, but it was brought shalol lishma, and that blocked off the kapara, now the sheni could sort of stand on the shoulders of the first carbon to effectuate that kapara that was meant to be effectuated by the first carbon. And now Rav Shisha asked, Elai Amrit Kipru, but if you're going to say that there was already a full atonement through the first carbon, is Sheni Lo Mubal, why are you bringing the second carbon? So basically, according to the logic of Rav Shisha, we should say that although the first carbon does not effectuate kapara, but nevertheless the second carbon will attach itself, so to speak, as an extension of the first carbon in order to achieve kapara. What happens? We said that if you bring a carbon ola, the carbon ola could be mechaper on a bittul asay. What happens if after you designated the carbon as an ola, then you avatal an essay? Will the carbon now be chal to generate kapara even on that which didn't exist at the time that he was magdish the carbon? Should we say chatos? Let's compare it to chatos. Ma chatos the kodem afrosha in the liach afrosha lo. If you violate a sin like eating chaylev after you are mafresh the korban chatos, that chatos does not have the power to effectuate kapara for that sin that you violated after you designated and we magdish the korban. Afacha here too now. Nami, same thing. The kodem afrosha in liach afrosha lo. O dilma lo damya lechatos. What do we have right to say? That a carbon ola is different than a carbon chatos. Why? The chatos I'll call chet v'chet boy lasuye chado chatos. The machayev of chatos is the sin itself, and therefore, if he violated multiple sins, he's got to bring multiple chatos. Each sin generates its own chatos. So, in other words, it's not the gavra who's achieving kapara through the chatos for all his averos. It's each avera generates an obligation on the person to bring a carbon. However, in the case of a carbon ola, what does it mean that a person violates many different assays and he didn't fulfill his mitzvah, and he brings one carbon ola on all those assays? He doesn't have to bring a separate carbon on each violation and bittul assay. And the answer is because the ola is machap on the gavra. If the ola is machap on the gavra, then whatever the pekalach the gavra is carrying at the time that he brings the carbon, the ola has the power to be machap for the gavra. Toshma, we have a brayso that says v'samach v'nirtza. Right at the time of the smicha on the carbon, when he leans his hands on the head of the animal, he then recites vidui, and then he'll achieve through the carbon a ritzui. V'chismicha mechaperes. Wait a minute. Smicha is not the mechaper. The mechaper is the dam. Halo ein kapara levidam shenemer ki adamu b'nefesh yechaper. Elamad tabalom v'somach v'nirtza lechaper she'im asa l'smicha shiori mitzvah malo levakosa ki lo kiper. That if he doesn't pay any attention to smicha, he finds it to be insignificant, so he doesn't do smicha. Therefore, the Torah considers it as if there was no kapara. On the other hand, the keeper, he did achieve kapara. So what's his middle state here? And the Gemara wants to suggest, the Gemara is going to reject this answer, but the original answer was the keeper essay to kodem afrasha v'lo keeper essay the smicha. Smicha itself is a chiyuv, and he treated it as lightly, and he didn't do smicha, so he was mevatel the mitzvah of smicha. And the pasuk is now telling me v'samach v'nirtza lechaper that there's no kapara for the absence of smicha. Because when did he violate smicha? It was after the Afrasha. You can't do smicha before Afrasha. Amarava asay the smicha kamrit. You're quoting me the mitzvah say of smicha. Shani hasam de kol kamadelo shachit ba'amod usmoch koi. The violation of smicha continues all the way until shchita. Is emas kahavi essay li'achar shchita. So the only time he's going to violate the essay is after he starts the avoda with shchita, when he finishes the shchita. At that point, he's violating the essay of smicha. He can't do smicha after shchita. The animal's already slaughtered; it's already dead on the ground. What you can do is you can do smicha while the animal's still alive. And liachar shchita lo kami boila. Right? We're not concerned with some sort of avera that he does after shchita. Right? And again, there are three time periods. There's the time that he designated the Ola. There's the time that he shechts the Ola. There's the time that he violates the essay of smicha. Now, the violation of the essay of smicha, because of Rava's principle of amod usmochkoi, is not violated till after the shechita. We never had a suffix. Could an animal be mechaper on an avera that was done after shechita, when the avoda has already begun? We were only talking about before the avoda, but after the original afrasha. Amalei Rav Huna Berei Rav Yehuda LeRava. So again, let's just go over the principle that there's no kapara for the violation of smicha through the korban olah, because he already shechted the korban at the time that he violated the essay. Is ema keeper gavra. Now, when the Brisa said lo keeper but v'keeper, so now we're saying that keeper gavra, right? Keeper gavra, as we said before, when the ola is brought, that korban is mechaper for the gavra on all the various averos that he committed, maybe even for omitting the mitzvah of smicha. So that's called keeper gavra.